Hello everybody and welcome to This Week in Politics. My name is Professor Lain Dare and I'm from the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra. And of course, I'm very lucky to be joined by Michelle Grattan. Hello, Michelle.
Hi, Lain.
It's been another amazing week in politics. Lots of very, very different things happening. But there's a lot more coming up over the next couple of months that are going to really push our Prime Minister. So Prime Minister Scott Morrison is now back from his US trip and he must settle down to finalise a new climate policy on which he can get a deal with the Nationals as the Glasgow Climate Conference looms. As Morrison grapples with the Nationals, funding is ramping up to help independent candidates to run in government seats on the climate issue in particular. Meanwhile, this week, Malcolm Turnbull has appeared on the National Press Club, virtually of course, with a massive attack on Scott Morrison, accusing him of deceiving the French on the submarine contract and saying that the PM has put at risk Australia's national security. With all this going on, Michelle, let's get stuck into these questions. Glasgow is getting close. So why has the government not yet secured a deal to endorse net zero emissions by 2050? Why are the major players making this so hard for him?
Well, as we know, the whole climate issue has dogged the Conservative side of politics for a decade, and it's not got any easier in recent times. But the pressures on Australia and now the pressures on Scott Morrison have intensified. Firstly, you've got Joe Biden and Boris Johnson really leaning on Australia and wanting Australia to increase its ambition for 2050, but also in the medium term. And then you've got the issue looming quite strongly in the coming election, and you mentioned these independents running. But this time, as opposed to when Malcolm Turnbull was dealing with this issue, it's not Liberals, a rump of Liberals resisting a more progressive policy, but it's the Nationals. Now, the Nationals, of course, were always very slow on this climate issue, but it was really the rump of the Liberal Party that was driving the difficulties previously. Now what we're seeing is that Barnaby Joyce, although he's opposed a firm 2050 target in the past, is now willing to do a deal with the Prime Minister. He doesn't want to have Scott Morrison not able to have a Glasgow policy that's credible, net zero by 2050, firmly embraced. But nevertheless, Barnaby Joyce has considerable difficulties within his own party. So we're seeing a lot of pushing and shoving, including in public. So, for example, this week, we saw Bridget McKenzie, who's a senior minister and the Nationals Senate leader, write an op-ed in the Fin Review, which was critical of Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer. So the whole notion of cabinet solidarity is out the window. But I think in the end, the stakes are so high that a deal will be cut.
In the background of all of this, the Prime Minister has recently identified that he might not attend the Glasgow conference. Would this be a bad decision?
Well, in a way, it's probably a line ball decision for him. Obviously, there's a lot of pressure to attend the Glasgow conference, and Malcolm Turnbull this week asked about Scott Morrison perhaps not going, said, well, it would show his priorities, be essentially a reflection on his priorities, that climate wasn't so important to him was the message there from Malcolm Turnbull. On the other hand, we are heading into a very difficult and uncertain period with COVID. As the community starts to open up, we expect to get more cases and more hospitalisations, more fatalities. So it's an awkward time for the Prime Minister to be out of the country in early November. And also the G20 meeting comes ahead of the climate conference. So it makes it a substantial trip. Then he's got to quarantine when he gets back. So if the COVID situation is looming as looking pretty bad, then I think a lot of people would say he should be here. So it really is quite a dilemma for him, I think.
And given all that, of course, he doesn't have as much power over the COVID situation as perhaps the state premiers do. So will that be influencing his decision, do you think?
Well, absolutely. There's been tension, of course, all through this pandemic between the federal government and some of the states and between the states. So the battle with states potentially is one factor, but what will be worrying both federal and state governments is whether the hospital system, which is under state control, can cope if there's a spike in cases as expected. And of course, while we will be at high vaccination levels, nevertheless, there'll be pockets of people who are unvaccinated, not by choice, but because the rollout hasn't been comprehensive enough to draw them in. So there'll be all sorts of exit problems, I think. And of course, there'll be calls for financial help. In some cases, we've seen Josh Frydenberg this week announce that the COVID disaster payment will be ended. But if we get outbreaks, then there'll be pressure to do something on the financial side. So it'll be a complicated situation for the government to manage. Scott Morrison's very anxious that Christmas looks good, but in terms of COVID, it's a long way till Christmas.
Go back to these independents, Michelle. Local groups are really gearing up again to back independent candidates in a number of Liberal seats. How important is this movement and what are the chances for independents in our next election?
I think it reflects not only concern about the issue of climate and incidentally the issue of integrity, which these independents are also likely to push, but it reflects the increasing disillusionment of the public with the main parties. Now, we did see a push for independence last election, and of course, Zali Steggall displaced Tony Abbott at that election. It's very difficult for independents to get through because of the voting system. I think that the move this time, the support for independence is somewhat stronger. I was talking with Simon Holmescourt this week on the Conversations podcast, if I can put in a plug, and he's got more than $1.5 million raised so far to support independence. So I think that they will be, in a way, a distraction for the government. I don't think we will see a whole lot of them getting through, but even if one new independent is elected and the ones presently, the crossbenchers presently in the House are returned, then if we, for example, had a hung parliament, that can be quite significant. And certainly I think that this independent movement, which is challenging government MPs in the so-called leafy suburb seats, will be a big feature of the coming election.
Absolutely. It's been a while since we had a hung parliament, has it not?
Well, we're sort of close now. The government has a one-seat majority, but we did have a hung parliament for a period before the 2019 election.
Quickly we forget, Michelle.
That's right. Well, it was only for a while. It wasn't for the term, but nevertheless, it's difficult for a government to manage.
Talking about difficult for the government to manage, Malcolm Turnbull this week was very strong in his lambasting of Scott Morrison for deceiving the French over the submarines contract. How much weight does Turnbull's attack carry?
Well, he has become very much an ongoing critic of the Morrison government. So to that extent, what he says is often discounted. But he did make a strong and I think correct point about how deceiving the French, keeping them in the dark before the cancellation of the submarine contract, was really bad diplomatically and will have long-term consequences for the government, not only in its relations with the French, but also with Europe more generally. And we are hearing this morning, we don't have details as we talk now, but we are hearing that apparently the Europeans have delayed the discussions for a free trade agreement with Australia. And I think that that's just a sign that they want to make the point that this is regarded as bad conduct internationally.
On that secrecy, is that not normal for Prime Minister Morrison to be doing policies in secret like that?
Well, his style, I guess, that we see domestically is that he likes to have maximum control in the government. He doesn't want things debated in a public sense before policies are tied down. And this is why there's such a contrast with the Nationals, who are out there debating the 2050 target without any restraint at all. But when you get to international dealings, I think that if you don't act in a diplomatic way, if you don't follow the normal protocols of how you treat other countries, then you can expect a backlash, and that's what we've got from France.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It's been a 1 week in politics, and I look forward to talking to you again about next week. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Lain.